The storm raged outside Grayson's diner, sheets of rain hammering against the large front windows, creating a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pattern of droplets that distorted the view of the world beyond. Lightning flashed across the sky, momentarily illuminating the parking lot in a stark, white glow before plunging everything back into murky shadows. The diner was a warm, bright contrast to the chaos outside, its neon sign flickering with an electric hum, casting a red-pink hue onto the rain-slicked pavement. Inside, the air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, buttered toast, and the faint tang of frying bacon, comforting scents that had become second nature to Harper. She moved behind the counter with the practiced ease of someone who had spent years memorizing every corner of the place. The chrome-edged stools at the bar shone under the hanging lights, their red leather seats reflecting the glow. A few regulars sat hunched over their plates, forks clinking against ceramic dishes, their conversations a quiet murmur beneath the occasional burst of laughter from a booth near the back. The storm had already made the night unusual, but the real disruption came when the deep, guttural growl of a motorcycle engine shattered the mundane normalcy of the diner. The sound was loud enough to make a few customers flinch, heads turning instinctively toward the rain-blurred windows. The bike's rumbling subsided, replaced by the heavy thunk of boots hitting wet pavement. A figure approached the entrance, momentarily outlined in the flickering light before the door swung open, a gust of cold air and rain swirling inside like an unwelcome specter. The entire diner seemed to still. Knox stepped inside, his presence an immediate disruption to the usual quiet harmony of the place. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wrapped in a soaked leather jacket that clung to his frame, rainwater dripping steadily onto the checkered linoleum floor. His dark jeans were damp, clinging to his legs, heavy from the downpour. Tattoos snaked down his forearms, stark against his tanned skin, disappearing under the edges of his sleeves. His hair, damp from the rain, curled slightly at the ends, but it was his piercing blue eyes that unsettled people the most, sharp, calculating, scanning the room like a predator assessing its surroundings. A thick silence blanketed the diner, tension crackling in the air like the storm outside. Harper could feel the shift immediately. People stiffened, mothers instinctively pulling their children closer, as if the mere presence of a man like him posed a threat. An elderly woman in the corner booth clutched her purse tighter, her fingers curling around the worn leather like it was a lifeline. A man at the counter, midway through stirring cream into his coffee, paused, his spoon clinking against the rim of his mug as his grip tightened. The uniformed sheriff, who had been nursing a slice of cherry pie at the far end of the bar, set his fork down and leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing in quiet scrutiny. Knox didn't react to any of it. He walked with purpose, his boots clicking against the floor as he made his way toward a corner booth at the back, keeping his gaze downcast. It wasn't shyness, it was calculation, a deliberate move to avoid unnecessary confrontation. He had been through this dance before. He knew exactly how small towns operated, how people here were quick to judge, quick to assume the worst. As he passed by the counter, Harper caught the faint scent of leather, rain, and something deeper, something earthy and raw. He didn't make eye contact with her, didn't acknowledge anyone. He simply slid into the booth, exhaling as he rested his forearms on the table, fingers interlocking loosely. Water pooled on the tabletop from his jacket, but he didn't seem to care. The tension in the diner didn't ease. In fact, it seemed to grow heavier. Whispers started, hushed but audible. "Who the hell is that?" someone muttered near the entrance. "Never seen him before," another voice responded, wary. "Probably trouble. Look at those tattoos." Harper bristled at the murmurs, her grip tightening around the rag she'd been using to wipe down the counter. She had worked here long enough to recognize the undercurrent of judgment in this town, the way it latched onto anyone who didn't fit the mold of respectable citizen. A man in a leather jacket, covered in ink, riding in on a motorcycle? That was enough for people to decide he was dangerous, untrustworthy. And yet, something about him didn't scream danger to her. There was an air of exhaustion around him, a weight in his posture that spoke of long miles traveled, of a man carrying more than just the burdens of the road. He wasn't looking for trouble. If anything, he seemed like he wanted nothing more than to be left alone. But small towns rarely granted that mercy. From across the room, The sheriff adjusted his belt, his expression unreadable as he took a slow sip of his coffee. The action was casual, but the message was clear. He was watching. The elderly woman near the window shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Knox and the nearest exit. A group of teenagers, probably just out of high school, sat in a booth near the jukebox, snickering to each other. One of them nudged the other, whispering something under his breath before they all erupted into muffled laughter. Harper took a slow breath, rolling her shoulders before grabbing a menu. If no one else was going to act like a damn adult, she would. She walked over to his table, her steps steady, purposeful. As she reached the booth, Knox finally looked up, those icy blue eyes locking onto hers. For a second, just a second, she thought she saw something flicker in his gaze, surprise, maybe, or curiosity. But it was gone just as fast, replaced with that unreadable, guarded expression. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice even. Knox hesitated for the briefest of moments before giving a small nod. "Yeah, black." She set the menu down in front of him, ignoring the way she could feel the weight of half the diner's eyes on them. "Anything else?" He glanced at the menu but didn't open it. "Just coffee. For now." She nodded, turning on her heel, but as she walked away, she caught another voice from the counter, just loud enough for her to hear. "Bet he's just passing through. Guys like that don't stick around." Harper clenched her jaw but didn't turn. The storm continued to howl outside, wind rattling the windows. And inside, the tension simmered, thick and unspoken. The diner, already thick with tension, seemed to hold its breath. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling through the cracks in the doorframe, but inside, the real storm was brewing at the counter. Harper didn't hesitate as she grabbed a clean towel and walked toward Knox's booth. She had seen that look before. The weariness, the discomfort, the way someone braced for the worst before it even happened. She wasn't about to let him feel like an outsider here, not on her watch. "Rough weather out there, huh?" she said as she handed him the towel, her voice warm, casual, like she hadn't noticed the way every eye in the diner was glued to them. Knox hesitated before taking it, his rough, calloused fingers brushing against the fabric as he gave a small nod. "Yeah. Just needed a place to sit for a bit." His voice was low, gravelly, the kind of voice that carried weight, that hinted at things left unsaid. Harper nodded, pretending not to notice the way his shoulders were drawn tight, like he was expecting someone to tell him to leave any second. "Can I get you something warm?" He hesitated again, then muttered, "Just coffee." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Left my wallet in my other jacket?" His tone was neutral, but Harper caught the flicker of something behind his eyes. Embarrassment, maybe, or frustration. Without hesitation, Harper smiled. "Coffee's on me. And don't worry about the sandwich, I'll cover it. You look like you need a hot meal." For a moment, Knox just stared at her. It wasn't the usual gratitude she expected, it was something deeper. A quiet sort of disbelief, like he wasn't used to kindness that didn't come with a price. She turned and walked back to the counter, but before she could even reach the coffee pot, a sharp, mocking voice sliced through the air. "Great. Now we're feeding criminals too." The words rang through the diner, loud and deliberate. Every conversation stopped. Even the rain outside seemed to hush for a moment. Harper spun around. The voice belonged to a middle-aged man sitting at the counter. He was dressed in a crisp suit, his tie slightly loosened as if he had just come from work. His expression was twisted in a smug sneer, his lip curled in obvious disdain. Knox's grip on his coffee mug tightened. His knuckles went white, the muscles in his jaw clenching, but he didn't say a word. He didn't even look at the man. Harper, however, had no such restraint. "Excuse me, sir, but he's just having a meal." "Same as you." The man scoffed. "People like him don't just stop for coffee. You should be careful who you're defending." The words dripped with condescension, a veiled accusation laced with something uglier. It wasn't just suspicion, it was the kind of judgment that had already made up its mind, the kind that saw a leather jacket and tattoos and decided a person's entire worth in an instant. Knox exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling as if he were biting back whatever he wanted to say. Harper's pulse pounded. "Or maybe people like you should stop judging before you know someone's story," she shot back, her voice steady but edged with fury. The man laughed, shaking his head. "Oh, come on. I've been around long enough to know his type." He turned, waving his hand vaguely toward Knox. "Riding into town on a bike, covered in ink, no money for a meal. How much you wanna bet he's got a record longer than this counter?" A few chuckles rippled through the diner. Not everyone laughed, but enough. Knox still said nothing. He didn't have to. The humiliation burned across his face, a quiet, simmering anger he forced himself to swallow. Harper could see it, the way he was holding himself still, the way his fingers flexed just slightly, like he was trying to keep from reacting, like he had learned long ago that fighting back never changed anything. And it made her blood boil. She took a step closer, placing herself between Knox and the man at the counter. "You don't know him. And unless you've got something useful to say, maybe keep your opinions to yourself." The man smirked, shaking his head as he turned back to his coffee. "Suit yourself. Just don't come crying when he proves me right." The tension hung thick in the air, heavy and suffocating. Harper could feel the way the other customers were watching, some out of curiosity, some out of discomfort, a few with something that looked like agreement. Knox finally lifted his coffee, taking a slow sip before setting the mug down carefully, deliberately. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely carried, he muttered, "You don't have to do that." Harper turned back to him, softening just a little. "Yeah, I do." She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Knox just nodded, looking down at his coffee. But Harper noticed that, for the first time since he walked in, his shoulders weren't quite as tense. The door slammed open, letting in another gust of wind and rain, but this time, it wasn't just another customer. It was Mr. Grayson, the owner of the diner, his face already red with irritation before he even spoke. The moment he stepped inside, his sharp gaze landed on the counter, taking in the way the room had gone stiff with tension. His eyes flickered from Harper, standing rigid near Knox's booth, to the suited man still nursing his coffee with a smug smirk. The atmosphere practically crackled with unease, but Grayson didn't waste time asking questions. "Harper!" His voice rang out like a slap. Heads turned, but no one spoke. He stormed toward her, his heavy boots echoing across the tiled floor. "A customer just walked out because of you." Harper clenched her jaw. She didn't need to ask who, probably some regular who had decided their coffee tasted worse because a man in a leather jacket was sitting a few tables away. She crossed her arms, meeting Mr. Grayson's glare head-on. "Because I stood up for someone who didn't deserve to be treated like trash?" The older man's mouth pressed into a thin line, but his frustration only deepened. "This is a business, not a charity. I don't pay you to play hero." Harper's stomach twisted. The unfairness of it, the sheer hypocrisy, made her blood boil. Mr. Grayson had let drunks stumble in after hours, let locals run up tabs they couldn't afford, let people sit in the booths long after closing just to get out of the cold. But now, when it was someone like Knox, suddenly the rules were different. "So you'd rather I kick out someone just because he looks different?" Her voice was steady, but she could feel the burn of frustration creeping into her cheeks. Grayson scoffed. "I'd rather you not drive away paying customers. You think people come here for arguments? For trouble?" He threw a pointed glance at Knox, who had gone completely still, his fingers curled around his coffee mug, his expression unreadable. Harper didn't back down. "I think people come here for a damn meal. And if we're picking and choosing who gets to eat, maybe I don't want to work here." Mr. Grayson's eyes narrowed. The diner was silent now, so quiet that even the hum of the old refrigerator behind the counter seemed too loud. The regulars were watching, some out of awkwardness, some out of something more bitter, like satisfaction. The suited man at the counter was grinning, as if enjoying the show. "You're done here." Grayson's words were final, his voice cold and sharp as glass. "Pack your things." For a moment, Harper thought she might be sick. She had worked at this diner for 5 years. She knew every booth, every regular, every tiny imperfection in the linoleum floor. It wasn't just a job. It was stability, it was familiarity. And just like that, because she refused to let someone be treated like garbage, it was gone. Silence stretched. Harper refused to let the sting of humiliation show on her face. She exhaled slowly, untied her apron with steady fingers, and folded it neatly before setting it on the counter. Then she turned to Knox. He was watching her, his blue eyes unreadable, his posture tense. For a man who had barely spoken since walking in, he looked like he had a lot to say. Harper forced a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good luck out there." She turned before he could respond. If she stayed a second longer, if she let herself dwell on the unfairness of it all, she might actually cry, and she refused to give anyone in that room the satisfaction. The moment she stepped outside, the cold air hit her like a slap, rain soaking through her thin sweater within seconds. She didn't have a plan, didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let them see her break. Harper stuffed the last of her things into her worn-out tote bag, her hands shaking with frustration more than anything else. The dull hum of the diner's conversations buzzed behind her, but she refused to look back. Let them talk. Let them whisper about how she had gotten herself fired over a stranger, over someone they had already decided wasn't worth the trouble. Outside, the rain was relentless, soaking through her sweater the second she stepped into the night air. She pulled her coat tighter around herself and kept walking. Her car was parked a few blocks away, and with every step, she tried to push down the rising humiliation, the sting of injustice that sat heavy in her chest. But just as she reached the curb, a distant sound rumbled through the air. Low at first. Distant. Then louder. The ground beneath her seemed to tremble. Harper turned, frowning. The rain blurred the streetlights, but in the distance, she saw them, rows of headlights cutting through the storm. The sound grew into a thunderous roar, filling the air with a deep, guttural vibration that sent a ripple of unease through her spine. Inside the diner, the customers had fallen silent. The suited man who had insulted Knox moments ago froze mid-sip, his face paling as the first motorcycle pulled into the parking lot. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the lot was packed. Over 100 motorcycles lined up in perfect formation, their engines growling, sending shudders through the glass windows of the diner. Leather-clad figures dismounted, their silhouettes barely visible through the sheets of rain. And then, the diner door swung open. Knox walked back in. But this time, he wasn't alone. A wave of men followed him inside, filling the entrance with dark figures, their presence suffocating. Water dripped from their leather jackets onto the floor, boots tracking mud across the black and white tiles. The fluorescent lights cast long shadows over their faces, making them seem larger, more menacing. The tension inside the diner was suffocating. No one moved. The suited man at the counter visibly swallowed, his hands clenching around his napkin. His confidence from earlier had evaporated. The waitress by the coffee machine hesitated mid-pour, her hands trembling slightly. Even Mr. Grayson, who had been so quick to throw Harper out, now looked uneasy. Knox took his time walking up to the counter, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't acknowledge the man who had insulted him, not yet. Instead, he placed both hands on the counter, his knuckles still faintly white from earlier. His crew stood behind him, silent, waiting. "Coffee," Knox said, his voice calm. "For everyone." Mr. Grayson hesitated, then quickly turned to the nearest waitress. "You heard him." His voice had lost its usual authority, reduced to something quieter, something careful. Harper, still standing near the exit, watched as the atmosphere shifted. The bikers spread out, taking over booths, counters, filling every available space. They didn't speak much, didn't laugh or joke. They just sat, their presence a statement in itself. A few of them glanced at Harper, then at Knox. She didn't know what to do. She should leave. She had no reason to be here anymore. And yet, the suited man cleared his throat, setting his coffee cup down carefully. "Listen," he started, his voice unnaturally high. "I think there's been some misunderstanding." Knox finally turned. For the first time since walking back in, he looked at the man directly. The customer immediately shrank under the weight of his gaze. "I don't think there has," Knox said, his voice quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made people nervous. The suited man shifted, eyes darting toward the exit. The diner suddenly felt too small, too enclosed. I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered. "Just a joke, you know? Didn't think." "You did," Knox cut in. "You thought real hard before you opened your mouth?" The man had nothing to say to that. The silence stretched, the weight of it pressing down on the room. Knox exhaled slowly, then turned his attention to Harper. His blue eyes, unreadable before, softened just slightly. "You leaving?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "I don't exactly have a job anymore," she said, her voice flat. A muscle in Knox's jaw twitched. He turned back to Mr. Grayson. The owner straightened, but his usual arrogance was gone. Knox leaned forward, voice low. "You fire her over me?" Grayson opened his mouth, but whatever excuse he was about to make died before it even left his lips. I don't run a business based on." "Yeah?" Knox said, cutting him off. "You do." Harper wasn't sure what was happening, but the way Mr. Grayson was gripping the edge of the counter told her he was regretting every decision he had made tonight. Knox exhaled through his nose, then looked at her again. "Come on." She blinked. "What?" He nodded toward the door. Harper hesitated, glancing at the diner, at the way everyone was still holding their breath, waiting. She didn't know what she expected him to say, but somehow, "come on," was enough. So she did. The moment Knox spoke, the air in the diner thickened, pressing down on the room like a weighted storm cloud. Mr. Grayson stiffened behind the counter, his usual smug confidence slipping as Knox slowly stepped forward, his boots thudding against the tile floor with deliberate slowness. The other customers, some frozen mid-bite, some gripping their coffee cups with white-knuckled hands, watched with wary, wide-eyed silence. Knox barely acknowledged them. His focus was solely on Harper. "Didn't get to say thanks earlier, Harper?" She blinked, caught off guard. "For what?" "For treating me like a person." He tilted his head slightly, his blue eyes sharp, unreadable. "Most don't." Harper felt her throat tighten, but she didn't look away. Knox turned then, facing Mr. Grayson directly. The diner owner had taken a step back, his fingers tapping anxiously against the counter, but he tried to maintain an air of control. "You fired her for showing kindness?" Knox asked, his voice deceptively calm, carrying the kind of quiet that made people nervous. Grayson scoffed, straightening his shoulders. "This isn't your concern." He tried to sound firm, but the slight waver in his voice gave him away. Knox smirked. A slow, knowing smirk that made the air feel even heavier. "Oh, it will be." He turned to his crew. "Order whatever you want. And leave big tips." A low chuckle rumbled through the group of bikers, followed by murmurs of approval. One of them, a tall, bearded man with a scar running down his cheek, grinned. "Sounds like we just found our new favorite spot." Mr. Grayson visibly paled. Within seconds, the diner was transformed. The bikers spread out, taking over booths, counters, and tables, their deep voices and the clatter of silverware filling the once tense silence. The scent of sizzling bacon and grilled burgers soon replaced the cold, nervous tension in the air. Waitresses scurried back and forth, scribbling down orders at a frantic pace as the kitchen fired up to full capacity. They ordered everything. Stacks of pancakes, triple cheeseburgers, club sandwiches, full breakfast platters. If it was on the menu, it was being cooked. Plates piled up on tables, coffee pots were drained and refilled, and the kitchen buzzed with the kind of energy that only came when a restaurant was at full tilt. But the real chaos came when the first bill was settled. A heavy slap echoed as the first biker placed his check on the counter. A $15 meal, bacon, eggs, and coffee. And beside it, a crisp $100 bill. Then another. And another. Every single biker, without fail, left the same tip. $100. Stacks of cash began piling up on the counter, the crisp green bills standing out against the cheap white receipts. The waitresses, who had spent most of the night terrified, now stood in stunned disbelief, hands shaking as they collected the tips. Harper watched, her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Grayson's face had gone from pale to ghostly white. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Knox leaned against the counter, watching him with amusement. "Problem?" Grayson swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. No." Knox smirked again. "Good." The suited man from earlier, the one who had insulted Knox in the first place, was now sitting stiffly at the counter, looking like he wished he could disappear into the floor. The coffee he had been drinking sat untouched, his fingers drumming anxiously against the counter's edge. Knox finally turned his attention to him. "You still got something to say?" His voice was light, casual, but there was an edge to it that sent a visible shudder through the man's shoulders. The suited man hesitated. His jaw clenched, and for a second, it looked like he might try to reclaim his earlier bravado. But then Knox just stared at him, unblinking, waiting. The man looked away. "No," he muttered. Knox hummed, seemingly satisfied, then turned back to Harper. "You still leaving?" She hesitated. She should. She had no job here anymore, nothing keeping her in this building except a sense of misplaced loyalty to a place that had thrown her out without hesitation. And yet, she looked at Mr. Grayson. Looked at the stack of cash sitting on the counter, the way his fingers twitched like he didn't know whether to grab it or shove it away. Then she looked at the waitresses, at their stunned, almost giddy expressions as they counted their tips, at the way they exchanged glances that spoke volumes. And then she looked back at Knox. He was watching her, waiting. Harper let out a slow breath, then tilted her chin up slightly. "Not yet?" Knox nodded once, like that was the answer he expected. And just like that, the balance in the diner shifted. The storm had finally eased into a steady drizzle, the pounding rain replaced by a quiet patter against the diner's windows. Inside, the chaos of the last few hours had settled. The tables were empty now, save for scattered napkins and half-drunk cups of coffee. The smell of grease and syrup still lingered, but the energy had shifted. Where there had once been tension, now there was something else. Something quieter. Harper stood behind the counter, arms crossed, watching the last few bikers gather their helmets and jackets. It still didn't feel real, how the night had turned, how Knox and his crew had completely flipped the script on everything. The tips the waitresses had collected sat heavy in their pockets, proof that tonight hadn't been like any other. Then Knox stepped forward, slipping something onto the counter in front of her. A plain envelope. Harper frowned. "What's this?" Knox met her gaze, steady as ever. "Your future?" A flicker of confusion crossed her face, but she reached for it, peeling back the flap. The moment she saw what was inside, her breath hitched. The deed to a cafe. Her hands shook as she pulled it out, eyes scanning the document over and over, unable to process what she was looking at. This isn't real." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Knox smirked. "It's real." He leaned one arm on the counter. "We pulled together to buy you a place where you won't get fired for doing the right thing." Harper swallowed hard, her throat suddenly tight. A woman biker, tall, blonde, with an easy confidence, grinned and clapped her on the shoulder. "Too bad if you don't want it. It's already yours." She winked. "We take care of our own." Harper's vision blurred. She blinked quickly, forcing back the emotion threatening to spill over. For 5 years, she had poured herself into Grayson's diner. 5 years of knowing every customer's order, every shift change, every crack in the counter. 5 years of loyalty, only to be thrown out the second she stood up for someone who needed it. And now she had something better. A place of her own. She barely had time to let it sink in before a voice broke the moment. "Wait, Harper, maybe I overreacted?" The words were hesitant, uncertain. Harper turned slowly. Mr. Grayson stood a few feet away, his expression somewhere between regret and desperation. His gaze flicked between the deed in her hands and the bikers still lingering near the door, as if he had just realized what he had lost. She could see it in his face. He knew. He knew he had made the worst mistake of his life. He had fired the wrong person, had sided with the wrong man, had let his pride cost him something he would never get back. And now it was too late. Harper tilted her head, a slow smile creeping onto her face. "Too late, boss," she said, sliding the deed back into the envelope. "I've got my own cafe now." Grayson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He looked completely lost, standing there in his own diner, suddenly realizing he had no control over what happened next. Knox clapped a hand on the counter, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "Well, looks like we'll be taking our business elsewhere." His smirk deepened as he glanced at Harper. "Someplace with better management." A ripple of laughter spread through the remaining bikers. Mr. Grayson's face drained of color. Harper didn't wait for him to respond. She stepped out from behind the counter, her head held high, and walked toward the door. This time, she wasn't leaving in shame. She was walking toward something better,